Hello, and thank you for joining me for Storytime with Mr. C. I am Mr. C, and for my regular listeners, welcome back. Thank you so much for staying with me. For those of you tuning in for the first time, welcome to the show. If you like what you hear, please go check out my first 5 episodes. Here on Storytime with Mr. C, I will be sharing stories that I have written, or a friend or family member has written, or maybe even something you have written. If you would like for me to share one of your stories here on Storytime with Mr. C, get your story or stories ready to go and shoot me an email at storytimewithmisterc@gmail.com. Again, that is storytimewithmisterc@gmail.com. And Mr. is spelled out Mister. I have also put the email down in the description for you. For now, I'm going to ask that you please keep stories to a maximum of 2,000 words, and please keep them family-friendly. And maybe, just maybe, I will read your story or stories in some of my future episodes. As always, a big thank you goes out to my buddy Russ for helping me out with my intro music. Russ is the bassist for local band Drive By High Five. If you get the opportunity to check them out in Tucson, Arizona, please do so. Go show them some love. Also, as always, big, huge thanks to Ben over at Chasing the Whimsy. You can find the link to his podcast down in the description as well. Please go check out his podcast, show him some love. And again, Ben, as always, thank you so much for your continued support. It means a lot. So, last week, I treated you all to the first of my spooky stories. Please let me know what you thought of it. Would you like to hear more, or do you prefer the nonfiction stuff more than the spooky stuff? Drop me a comment or an email. Let me know your thoughts, please. For this, our 6th episode, as promised, I am returning back to Father Allen, and I will be sharing the 6th chapter from my stories about my father. And, strangely enough, if you listen to last week's episode, the spooky story, you may detect the origins of some of that story's content in today's story. So listen closely and you will hear what I mean. All right, folks, enough babbling. Here we go with episode 6. Stand by.
Storytime with Mr. C.
Storytime.
Thank you once again for joining me for this episode of Storytime with Mr. C. This is the next chapter in my collection of stories I wrote about my father. This is Shotgun Bonding from Father Allen. Once upon a time, when I was still in my single digits and weighing all of 50 pounds, my father decided that it was time to do some father-son bonding. This meant that we were going to load up Bessie the Chevy with his numerous firearms, pack a thermos full of bourbon, and go shoot something. We drove for what seemed like the better part of the day. We passed every landmark I was familiar with, the asphalt turned to dirt, and still we drove on. We bounced through the desert with a pile of guns clattering around in the back seat, and eventually discovered the perfect spot. A large dirt clearing, littered with spent shotgun shells and all manner of debris. Shards of glass bottles, soda cans, pieces of furniture, and even an old television set lay scattered about the desert floor, riddled with holes. It was obvious that many fathers and sons had bonded in this sacred place. At the other end of the clearing, about 50 yards away, was the side of a mountain. Well, it may have just been a big hill at 20 feet away, but I was a kid, and I was small. My father directed me to gather some of the larger bits of debris and set them in front of the mountain at various distances. "Try to find some bottles," he hollered as I picked through the remains of the innocent recyclables that had been slaughtered here. I found what I thought were some acceptable chunks and excitedly placed them around the clearing while my father pulled his arsenal from the car. I bounded over to him, and he thrust a weapon into my hands. It was the .22, a petite, slender rifle that fired one little brass bullet at a time. "Don't hurt yourself," he said through a smile, and emptied half his thermos in one mighty gulp. I had seen my father load the .22 before, so I figured that I could take care of business. I shoved a handful of bullets in my pocket and picked my prey, an aluminum can that I had purposely set nice and close just for me. I had every intention of sending this can back to its maker. I loaded up, pressed the rifle against my right shoulder, took aim, and pulled the trigger. It was very anticlimactic. There was a little popping sound from the gun as it kicked against my shoulder, but the can didn't even move. I reloaded and fired again. The can stood unmoving, mocking me. I loaded another bullet into my instrument of destruction and prepared to wreak havoc upon the aluminum fiend. I figured that if I squeezed the trigger really hard this time, maybe— kaboom! It was the loudest thing I had ever heard in my life, and whatever it was had made my can disappear entirely. I turned around and found my father holding a very big, very cool-looking shotgun. "Is that what you were aiming for?" He chuckled as he broke open the barrel and spat out the still-smoking shell. "What is it?" I asked, my eyes wide with awe. "This is the 12-gauge, he explained. "It's a man's gun." I watched as he loaded another of the large red shells into the man's gun and brought it back up to his shoulder. The sound barrier was broken once again, and the chunks of a toaster I had found flew through the air. With renewed vigor, I raised my rifle and laid waste to absolutely nothing. A pathetic little plink sound was all I was getting out of this gun. I tried again and still couldn't seem to hit anything. My frustration rapidly began to get the better of me. I wanted to destroy something like my father had. I wanted to send parts of a household appliance sailing through the sky. I wanted the carnage to pile up before me. So I started to pout. My father looked at me and snorted. "What's the problem?" he asked. I forced my lower lip out as far as it would go. He just stared at me for a second and then shoved the shotgun in my direction. "You want to shoot it? Want to shoot the man's gun?" I thrust the .22 into his free hand and snatched the shotgun. It was heavy, really heavy. I wrestled it up against my shoulder and fought to hold it steady. "Hold it tight," my father said, as the remaining contents of his thermos disappeared down his throat. My arms trembled as I squinted down the barrel of the enormous weapon. It was impossible for me to aim at anything as the rifle bobbed and weaved. My breathing slowed and my pointer finger slowly squoze. And then my world suddenly became a big mess of noise and hurt. The percussive blast shook me to the core, filling my ears to the rim as bolts of pain shot through my tiny body. I stood frozen in space, deaf to the outside world, and wishing that my mommy was there. As my body slowly settled back into itself, sound came trickling back to my wounded ears. Just above the omnipresent squeal that now resided there, I could barely hear another sound. The sound of my father, laughing. Tears flooded down, mixing with the dirt on my face, and I came to the realization that my hands were empty. Where did the man's gun go? I looked up at my father for some sort of answer, but he simply chuckled away, shaking his head like he did whenever I had done something dumb. He continued his head shaking as he walked behind me and collected the 12-gauge from the ground. "I told you to hold on tight." He inspected the gun for any signs of damage, apparently unaware that I was the one who had suffered injury. I looked down to inspect myself and saw blood. Lots of blood. A pattern of red was sprayed across my t-shirt and more ran down my leg and trickled into my shoe. The man's gun had thoroughly kicked my ass. It had kicked so violently that it had flown from my hands, driving its hammer through the flesh just under my right collarbone. Not satisfied with delivering just one wound, it had somehow managed to rip a matching gouge across my right thigh before crashing to the ground behind me. I could see my skin starting to discolor through the tear in my shirt. Shades of yellow and purple mixed with my blood in a nauseating rainbow of gore. I looked back at my father and began to sob uncontrollably. He sighed deeply, wandered over to the car. He threw the 22 and the 12 gauge back into the back seat and slammed the door. "Come on," he muttered as he retrieved his thermos, walked around to the other side of the car and got in. I hacked and coughed, snot running down my face as I slowly and painfully shuffled to the passenger side. My father leaned across the front seat and pushed open the door. "Hurry it up," he said, as I eased myself into the seat and pulled the door shut with my non-dominant hand. Dirt sprayed into the air as my father tore away from our bonding space and headed home. I sat for the entire trip with my arms held out in front of me, scared that I might injure myself further if I moved even the tiniest bit. My father never said a word. We arrived at the house as the sun disappeared behind the horizon, and my father immediately started busying himself with unloading our cargo. I carefully removed myself from the car and wandered inside, still crying and choking on my own spit. Blood had soaked through most of my shirt and covered the entire length of my leg. Mom came out to greet us and froze in her tracks. Her eyes became huge as she stared at the bloody boy in front of her. She told me years later that I was such a bloody mess, she was terrified that my father had actually shot me. She quickly regained her composure and immediately went into Mama Bear/ER nurse mode. She pulled me into the bathroom, sat me on the toilet. Every manner of ointment, salve, and bandage was pulled from every cupboard and drawer that we had as my mom patched me up with the tenderness only a mother can possess. The tenderness I had desperately yearned for from the moment the man's gun had leapt from my hands. Mom finished repairing me, dried my tears, and only then became furious. Who could blame her? The same man who had fathered her children had placed a highly powerful instrument of death in the hands of the youngest one. The following day, my father approached me with an unfamiliar look in his eyes. He held out his giant fist as if he had something to give me. So I raised my hand and he dropped something into it. A large red shotgun shell, blown open and emptied of its contents. "That's the one that kicked your ass," he said, and then turned around and walked away. I kept that shell for the longest time, but it eventually disappeared. I don't know what happened to it, but I do still have a couple of souvenirs from that day. A rather attractive scar on my chest and a matching one on my thigh. They have faded over the years, but you can still make them out. It was a very long time before I ever shot another 12 gauge, but now I actually enjoy it. I try to join my brothers as often as I can for some shotgun bonding of our own. Granted, the only reason I ever became comfortable with the whole thing was because my stepdad taught me the proper way to handle firearms. He taught me how to respect them and how to stay safe when handling them, while my biological father only ever taught me how to fear them. As another for instance, my mother was in the hospital and my father and sister were going to visit her. I was unable to go along as I had become afflicted with chickenpox. I explained to my father that I was scared to be left alone, so he had a solution. He placed a 5-gallon bucket next to the couch where I had parked myself for the evening. He then set the butt end of the 12 gauge in the bucket and propped the barrel against the couch, making sure it was within my reach. "There," he huffed. "Now you don't have to be scared." Needless to say, it did not work. Thank you so much for joining me for this 6th episode of Storytime with Mr. C. That was Shotgun Bonding from Father Allen, my collection of stories about my father. I will be reading you the next story from Father Allen next week. That will be available on Sunday, the 10th of August. And again, drop me a comment or an email and let me know which of the stories you prefer, Father Allen or spooky stuff. Tell me which you want to hear more of, please. In the meantime, go check out Ben's podcast, Chasing the Whimsy. And if you get a chance to find Drive-By High Five out there in the wild, please go check them out as well. Thanks again for hanging out and listening to my story. Hope you come on back for the next one. Until then, take care, be safe.